Okay, so at this point, we should be ready to start talking about the different groups of plants. And what I want us to do is talk about these groups in their evolutionary order. It makes most sense to walk it through that way. And what were the earliest plants on land? What traits and features did they have that made them successful? But then what new traits evolved to make new plants more successful than the earliest ones, and so on and so on. So we're going to kind of walk through this in an evolutionary perspective and take a look at how these plants have evolved over time. And obviously some went extinct, other groups continued to flourish. Some of them, their diversity reduced, but they're still around, and so on. So again, keep in mind the evolutionary perspective here as we walk our way through the land plants. So, all right, so the first kind of big group to talk about are the bryophytes. Now, bryophytes are a broad category. And actually, let me zoom back up here. Okay, remember this? Bryophyta. Let's get a different color. Okay, so bryophytes right here. This particular grouping includes the liverworts, the mosses, and the hornworts. They are all collectively called bryophytes. The bryophytes themselves are going to be the closest living relative to the earliest land plants. Okay, to the first land plants. The closest living relative / we could say descendant to the earliest land plants. Generically, sometimes we'll refer to them as non-tracheophytes, meaning these plants don't have tracheids. So remember, previous lecture, tracheids? Tracheids are cells for transporting water and nutrients. It allows you to overcome gravity. It makes you bigger and taller. These guys don't have them. None of the bryophytes will have tracheids. That's why we call them the non-tracheophytes, which means in general the bryophytes are smaller, they're flatter, they're low-lying. They just don't get big. They're not a big plant. But when you're the first ones on land, or you evolve from the first ones on land, you don't need to get big. Why grow big? Why be 12 feet if 2 feet is good enough? You don't need to expend the energy to be bigger if a 2-foot plant is successful, or in their case, a 2-inch plant is successful. And again, remember, a lot of this is due to the lack of competition. When you're the first ones there, excuse me, there's no competition. You don't need to do a whole lot. You don't start evolving all these crazy, unique, novel structures until competition starts building and getting harder and harder and harder to deal with. So, okay, so let's take a look at the bryophytes as a group. And within that group, we're going to have our liverworts, mosses, and hornworts. Those are the 3 subcategories within the bryophytes. All right, so the first one to talk about are the liverworts. Some classification still places these guys in phylum Hepaticophyta. Based on the molecular evidence and what we know, these guys, it's believed, are the first plants to colonize land. So they're the first ones out there. No competition. You don't need to be crazy big. So in general, they're flattened. They have these lobe-like gametophytes that, let me move this down, that, oh, sorry, I'm kind of butchering this here. Get rid of that. That make up their body. So This thing right here, the structure you're looking at here, this is a liverwort. Now, here's the dumb trivia for you. Liverwort, early botanists who were identifying these things thought they looked like livers, the human liver, the lobes of a liver. That's where they got the common name liverwort. All right, so that trivia will get you, I don't know what it'll get you. But anyway, flattened lobe-like gametophytes. So they're not real big, they're low-lying. They have these little air chambers with pores which function in gas exchange that allow carbon dioxide in, oxygen out, because they are photosynthesizing. Other things to mention about them, they will have a structure known as a Gamecup. That they use for reproduction. Let me circle that or show you that, point that out. So the Gamecup is this little structure right here. This one here, over here, over here. So from the side, the Gamecup looks kind of like a little cup. There's the flattened body of the liverwort, and inside of it, it will produce new cells through mitosis. And then when it rains, water splashes in here, fills it up, and it splashes out your reproductive cells, your little structures. So it's a way of asexual reproduction through the Gamecup. When they go to reproduce sexually, they will produce two structures. The Archegonia, which is going to be the female structure, and the Antheridia, which is going to be the male structure. So the picture to the right, this is the Archegonia. It looks almost like a little umbrella, kind of a fingered umbrella. The Antheridia, we'll see that in lab, slightly different shape to that one. And what will happen is the male gametophyte, the Antheridia, will produce sperm. The Archegonia will produce the egg, and then the sperm uses water to swim over to the egg. So that's going to be a big thing to keep in mind or to remember about these guys is, let me go back here, is they're tied to water for reproduction. So sometimes people call the bryophytes the amphibians of the plant world because they still have to have water for reproduction. So, okay, I'm going to attempt to do a quick drawing to give you kind of the bigger picture. Here's the liverwort, kind of the body. Generically, this structure can be called the thallus. There's little Gamecups. So let me change that a little bit. Okay. So the body of it, thallus. You know what? Let's make that cleaner. Simpler and look better. Okay, so the thallus is the body. So I'm just going to run a list of terms here for you guys to help you remember these structures and what they are and what they do. All right, so you got the body of the liverwort. You got the Gamecup. Asexual reproduction. Okay. Little tiny anchor-like structures. These are not roots. Do not call them a root. But there's these little anchor-like structures coming off the bottom here that will anchor it to the soil. These things are known as rhizoids. that help hold it to the soil. Right? Again, not a root, so don't call them roots. When it becomes time for that reproduction, for sexual reproduction, you get this little stalk growing up, and there's your Archegonia, and then the Antheridia. Actually, I'm going to change color on this guy. We'll make it blue for a boy structure. Antheridia. And then the sperm have to get washed or splashed to the egg. So Archegonia makes the egg. Antheridia makes a sperm. All right, so there's our general structure for the liverworts. Tends to be found, or these guys tend to be found in moist, wet environments because they constantly need moisture for reproduction and survival. Diffusion of water into their cells. They don't have a true root system, so it's not like they can actually absorb water up through a root system. So pretty simple. But you know what? When you're the first one on land, who cares? It works. And it made them successful for close to 450 million years, and they're still out there. Their diversity is not nearly as great as it used to be, but they're still out there. We still have these in Illinois, we have them in the Midwest, across the United States, different parts of the world. So they're out there. All right, second group of bryophytes. These are the mosses. Now, sometimes people will still group the mosses into phylum Bryophyta. So it gets kind of confusing when you're like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Is it phylum grouping, etc.? When you see Bryophyta, think big arching umbrella of plants that contain 3 different groups. So, okay, so generally, when we look at most mosses, they're a gametophyte that is leaf-like on a stem. And some of the terms we used with the liverworts will apply here. But generally, when you see moss, you're looking at the gametophyte. All right, let me drop a new slide in here. All right, so let's take a look at the moss structure. Okay, so get outside. I want you guys to go look for this. Mosses are pretty easy to find. Go anywhere you have kind of a moist environment, damp, underneath trees, sides of buildings, etc. And you see all this little stuff here, these tiny little leaf-like structures. Okay, so now if I took one of these and zoomed it up and blew it up, you got something that looks like this. This is the actual gametophyte of the moss. If you could imagine, it almost looks like a miniature little Christmas tree. Okay, so this is the gametophyte. All right, so you got your gametophyte there. Once you have the gametophyte, you have an anchoring structure holding it to a substrate. acting as an anchor. And remember what we called that. The rhizoids. The little anchoring structures there. When moss goes to reproduce, the Archegonia is going to be the female structure. She will make an egg. The Antheridia, the male structure, will make the sperm. Now, what we'll see is that on the top of a moss, I gotta get my pen back out. There's going to be the Archegonia and the Antheridia. So you'll have one little moss here that produces an Archegonia. And I'm going to color this one blue. They're not blue. They're all green. But this is going to be your Antheridia moss. So you can have boy moss, girl moss. Some species you'll have both Antheridia, Archegonia at the top of the same structure. But then water helps get the sperm over to the egg here. So the sperm goes from the Antheridia over to the egg of the Archegonia. Fertilization happens. If fertilization occurs, then a structure known as the sporophyte will grow up out of the moss. So that little structure there is the sporophyte. And within the sporophyte, we will see the production of spores. So what the sporophyte will do is it'll elevate the spores above the gametophytes, and usually it's a moisture issue. When there's less moisture, it causes the sporophyte to pop open, and the hope is that those spores get launched as far away from the gametophytes as possible to colonize a new environment. Stress, pop your sporophyte, release your spores, and there you go. So when we're looking at the general structure microscopically, here's the Antheridia producing sperm. Here's an Archegonia, or two of them, producing the egg. The egg is that little circle down there at the end of the arrow. And the sperm will have to swim over here to Archegonia, get all the way down there, fertilize that egg, and then now it creates a zygote. Zygote develops into the embryo. Embryo grows, develops into the sporophyte. Sporophyte produces spores, and those spores then germinate, produce new gametophytes. Life cycle continues. But what we'll see is most of the life cycle for a moss is spent as a gametophyte. That's a little green thing here that we often see. So again, I want you guys, go outside right now, stop the lecture. This is the end of this part. Go outside, find some moss, take some pictures, see if there are any sporophytes. It depends on the time of year and the type of moss. You may be able to see sporophytes there. Check them. Are they full? Do they have spores in them, or are they cracked open? They've already released their spores. Again, it's all dependent upon the time of year that you're out there looking. But we're going to stop here. This is the end of this part, and go find yourself some moss.